Hi all, and welcome to Let's Read Is God a Delusion by Eric Reitan. In this series, I read through and respond to this liberal Christian apologetics book from my sceptical lay perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover all of Chapter 6, Philosophy and God's Existence, Part 2. This chapter is a continuation of the last, in which Reitan introduced the cosmological argument and discussed, but dismissed, the teleological argument. This chapter begins with Reitan musing about why anything at all exists. That is, why is there something rather than nothing? Reitan claims that the common response to this is that there is simply no reason why anything exists. However, he rejects this answer, instead claiming that if we insist there must be some reason, that this is the start of the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument of Leibniz and Clark. This section starts with Reitan presenting Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz's version of the cosmological argument. Put simply, Leibniz's argument is that the way the world happens to be cannot explain why it is that way. That is, even a full understanding of the laws that govern the universe wouldn't give us an explanation of why there is something rather than nothing, or why the universe follows those particular laws and not others. Reitan summarises Leibniz's argument like this. Leibniz, however, grants for argument's sake that you can always explain the present state of things by appeal to a preceding one that gives rise to it according to certain laws. In short, he grants that an infinite regress of scientific explanations, in terms of antecedent conditions and observable laws, is possible. His point is that even if we grant this, we still need an ultimate cause of the universe beyond this world, in order to explain why this infinite chain of contingent states exists at all. I agree with this, as long as we recognise that embedded in it is the assumption that an ultimate cause must exist. That is, if we accept that things need to have an explanation, then an infinite sequence of scientific explanations does seem wanting. Reitan quotes Leibniz as formulating the basis of his argument as the principle of sufficient reason. This principle is the idea that anything that is true of reality, or that exists in reality, must have sufficient reason for doing so. That is, that there is a reason that reality is the way it is, and not otherwise. Leibniz acknowledges that such reasons may well be unknown, or perhaps even unknowable, but that they exist in some sense. The important thing here is that according to Leibniz, the way that the universe is, and what exists within it, is contingent rather than necessary. That is, the way that things are is dependent on the way that things were and the laws of physics, and cannot ultimately explain themselves. Since they could have been differently, the way that they happen to be is contingent on other factors. Or, as Reitan puts it, the crucial fact about contingent beings is that the reason for their existence lies in something else. The crucial fact about a necessary being is that the reason for its existence lies in itself. If everything needs to have a reason for its existence, then these options exhaust the possibilities. A thing's existence is explained either by something else or by itself. This is a true dichotomy, and the only concern I have here is that he is casually switching between talking about beings and things. This is not a problem here, but last chapter he did the same when discussing the hypothetical cause of the universe. Also, note at this point the existence of a necessary thing is purely hypothetical. To establish that such a thing must exist, Reitan turns to Samuel Clark, who, like Leibniz, was also a 17th and 18th century philosopher. Quote, Clark argues that even if every dependent being is explained by a previous one in an infinite regress, we still need to explain the whole collection of dependent beings. Since no member or subset explains itself, there is nothing in the collection that explains the whole. And so, to explain the existence of the entire collection of dependent things, we need something that isn't part of that collection. In other words, something beyond the universe of dependent things that can explain both itself and everything else. In short, we need a self-existent or necessary being. As foreshadowed, Reitan is discussing a necessary being prematurely, when even if this argument worked, all he would have was a necessary thing. And this argument doesn't work, because it commits the fallacy of composition. It is intuitive that if everything in the collection of things is dependent, then the entire collection must also be dependent, but this reasoning is invalid. Ironically, Reitan actually mentions this fallacy later in this chapter. In order to conclude that the collection of all dependent things is self-dependent, Reitan would need an argument. Lest this seem like a trivial objection, there are philosophically respectable ideas that rest on precisely this idea. Most notable is the coherence notion of truth or justification. This is the idea that truth is not about correspondence with an external reality, but rather coherence as a set of true statements. The basic notion is that no true statement can justify itself, but that a collection of true statements can justify the collection. Now, I'm not qualified to defend such a theory, but I bring it up as a rebuttal to the naive notion that Reitan is pushing, that a collection of contingent things, like the universe, necessarily needs external explanation. Reitan closes this section by discussing what a necessary being would be like. He puts it like this. Such a being would be like nothing in ordinary experience. If this argument succeeds, it shows that the existence of every contingent thing is explained by a mysterious reality beyond the world of contingent things encountered with our senses. It shows, in short, that there exists something that is both transcendent, it falls outside the empirical world, and fundamental. It explains the existence of everything else. Notice, again, how he uses the terms being and thing interchangeably. And also notice how he just assumes that because everything we experience is contingent, that a necessary thing must be completely different. This is intuitively appealing, but hardly justified. We simply have no examples of confirmed necessary things, and so we need more than just our intuition that they are somehow mysterious and unlike empirical reality. Also, this argument only proves the existence of some transcendent explanation for existence, not that such an explanation needs to be a thing, or unique, or a being, and certainly not that it is the same God that Reitan went to such great pains to define in chapters 2 and 3. Ontological arguments and the concept of a necessary being. In this next section, Reitan continues with the idea of a necessary being. He starts by discussing 18th century philosopher David Hume's objection, which Reitan puts like this. He claimed that the idea of something that has to exist makes no sense. In his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, he reasons as follows. Anything that I can imagine to exist, I can also imagine not to exist. And if I can imagine it, it's possible. Non-existence is therefore never impossible, and existence is never necessary. And so there is no being whose existence is necessary. I have great reservations about equating that which we can imagine with that which is possible. But Hume, according to Reitan, did actually argue the case. The basis for Hume's argument is that he considered our imagination to be grounded ultimately in our experience of the universe through our senses. His idea was that because of this, our imagination will always be a reflection of reality, and we ultimately cannot imagine anything that is logically impossible. That's not to say that we can't describe a contradiction, like a square circle, but that we can't imagine it. Reitan disagrees with Hume, arguing that simply because everything we can conceive of is contingent, doesn't mean that there aren't things beyond our conception that are necessary. On this, I agree with Reitan. I think Hume's ideas have merit, but I don't think our imagination is ultimately the arbiter of what is logically possible. At this point in the section, Reitan introduces the ontological argument for God. Put simply, the ontological argument is that if we define God as the greatest possible being, since it is greater to exist than not exist, therefore God must exist. That is, if God is the greatest possible being, but he doesn't exist, then there can be a greater being who is identical to God, but who does exist. Therefore, to be the greatest possible being entails that he must exist. There are many arguments against the ontological argument, and the main one that Reitan considers is from another 18th century philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Reitan describes Kant's objection like this. He argued that existence cannot be part of the concept of anything, let alone God, because to say that something exists is just to say that a concept has an instance in the real world. It doesn't add anything to our concept. In Kant's terms, existence is not a real predicate. This is a solid philosophical objection, as if you allow existence to be a property of a thing, this would mean that we could simply define things as having the property of existence, and that would make them exist. Clearly, that's not how it works in reality, and so there must be something wrong with this idea. However, Reitan seems to miss this objection, and instead notes that some critics have argued that it is not clear that existence adds anything to a definition. That is, adding existence to the concept of something doesn't seem to actually add anything to its definition, but rather to our understanding of the world. Reitan responds that there is another version of the ontological argument that gets around this issue by defining God as existing necessarily rather than contingently. He puts it like this. To say that God exists necessarily rather than just contingently is to describe God, not just say that a being fitting God's description is found in reality. It tells us that if God is found in a world, it's because God is found in every possible world. Saying that God exists may not add anything substantive to our idea of God, but saying that his non-existence is impossible surely does. The problem is that simply defining God as existing necessarily is not the same as him not being able to not exist. At best, it is saying that if God exists, then he exists necessarily. That is, he either exists in all possible worlds or none. But I'm not sure how that really adds anything to the definition of God, without first establishing that possible worlds are meaningful in some sense. We're still left with one actual world in which we exist, and God either does or does not exist in this world. The real problem is that whether something exists necessarily or contingently cannot be a fundamental property of it, but rather comes from the nature of reality. For example, consider the necessary, which is a creature that is identical to the cassowary, but whose existence is necessary rather than contingent. Suppose I present a creature to you and ask you whether it is a necessary or a cassowary. How could you possibly distinguish the two? If necessary existence was a meaningful property, then there should be some meaningful difference between a necessary and a cassowary. The same problem occurs with God, except we can't even examine God. There are many other problems with the ontological argument, and ultimately, Reitan is not actually interested in defending it. His stated goal is to use it as a way of discussing what a necessary being would be like. I suspect he also introduces it as a way of suggesting that there are other arguments for the existence of God without actually having to defend them. Just as he ultimately dropped the teleological argument, I suspect he's hoping it will leave us with the impression that these arguments are not his focus, but are nonetheless sound. Reitan acknowledges that if God exists necessarily, it means that either he exists in all possible worlds or in none. He then argues that this means that if he exists in at least one possible world, then he must exist in all. This is sound, but he puts it like this. And so, if you think an infinite being might be possible, and to insist confidently that it's impossible is just the kind of intellectual arrogance we should be cautious of when dealing with the infinite, then such a being would be a good candidate for the necessary being that, according to the cosmological argument, must exist in order to explain the world. There's a big problem here. Reitan is equivocating on the meanings of the word possible. In the ontological argument, when we say that it is possible that God exists, we mean that he does actually exist in some possible world. But that is different to the colloquial sense in which he uses it here. Here, to say that it is possible that God exists is a statement about our state of knowledge. These are two very different things. Consider Goldbach's conjecture. This is the proposition that all even numbers greater than 2 can be expressed as the sum of 2 primes. This has not been proven to be true or false, and is perhaps the greatest unsolved problem in number theory. In common parlance, it is possible that it is true. But in the language of the ontological argument, it is either necessarily true or necessarily false. It cannot be merely possibly true, as mathematical results are either true in every possible world or in none. And the fact that mathematicians will readily say that it is possibly true doesn't allow us to conclude that it must be true in this world. The other problem here is that Reitan is hastily assuming that there can only be one necessary, perfect, self-explanatory being. None of that is justified by these arguments. The ontological argument, if it was sound, would only establish that some kind of perfect, necessary being exists. The cosmological argument, if it was sound, would only establish that there is an ultimate explanation for why everything exists. Reitan just wants to assume that one must also be the other. While this is intuitively attractive, it is hardly conclusively demonstrated. Before closing the section, Reitan returns to Richard Dawkins' argument from the last chapter, that God is improbable. Reitan's point here is that since a necessary being would exist in all possible worlds, it cannot properly be described as improbable. He puts it like this. But here's the problem. For Leibniz and Clark, God names the necessary being that has to exist in order to explain the universe. But while you might think that such a being is impossible, you cannot say it's improbable. The existence of a contingent being, with the power to design and create the universe, might coherently be called improbable, but it makes no sense to make such a claim about a necessary being. This rests on a bad understanding of probability. Consider Goldbach's conjecture again. It is either true or false, and is necessarily so either way. But we can still ask what the probability is that it is true. On the current state of research, it seems very likely that it is, in fact, true. Similarly, even though God either does or does not exist, it is still meaningful to discuss probabilities. Why not a self-existent universe? One simple objection to the cosmological argument is that if things need a cause or explanation, then why can't the universe itself be its own cause or explanation? According to Reitan, such an objection was raised by Hume and more recently by Daniel Dennett. Reitan dismisses Dennett's objection as being hand-waving and disparages such a casual response as unworthy of such a genius as Leibniz, who also invented calculus. Why his mathematical achievements mean his philosophical arguments should be taken more seriously isn't explained. Reitan summarises the idea that the universe itself exists necessarily like this. The proposal amounts to this. There is something about the universe that transcends empirical experience and is thus essentially mysterious. For the universe to explain its own existence, there needs to be more to it than meets the empirical eye. The universe must have a supernatural side to it that's inaccessible to science. This argument rests on the idea that the empirical world exists contingently. But Reitan hasn't actually established this. The closest he's come is to argue that the universe, and the laws governing it, could have been otherwise, and hence is contingent. But that is far from a universally accepted claim. The burden of proof here is on Reitan to produce a convincing argument for why the empirical world is entirely contingent, and so far he's failed to do so, instead appealing to incredulity. The rest of this section is Reitan arguing against the idea that science can provide a reason for the existence of the universe. In a nutshell, Reitan's argument is even if quantum mechanics, say, provides a good explanation for the Big Bang, and even if we have a complete physical picture of the universe, it will always be possible to ask why the laws of physics are the way they are. That is, we can always take a step back and ask of any explanation why that explanation happens to be that way. Therefore, according to Reitan, no scientific explanation can ever provide an ultimate explanation. As far as this argument goes, I agree with Reitan. If we accept the idea that the empirical world is contingent, and that there must exist some ultimate explanation, then it follows that science cannot provide such an explanation. My objection is that I don't accept either of Reitan's premises here. The contestable principle of sufficient reason. The bulk of this chapter has been Reitan laying out how the cosmological argument establishes that there is an ultimate explanation for the existence of the universe, and that such an explanation must be something that exists necessarily. He's smuggled in the idea that such an explanation is a being, and that it is also the perfect being of the ontological argument. But the fundamental gap in Reitan's argument so far is that he has invoked, but not defended, Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. Reitan defines the principle like this. By far, the most important objection to the cosmological argument attacks the principle that underlies it, the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR. Put simply, PSR says that for everything that is the case, there is a sufficient reason why it, rather than something else, is the case. If we reject this principle, we can always hold that the existence of the universe is just a brute fact. We could hold that there is no explanation for the universe, no reason why there is something rather than nothing. Reitan notes that there seems to be no philosophical or scientific reason why this principle should hold. His response is this. I want to begin my reply in what might be a surprising way. I want to say that, on one level, this objection succeeds. It calls into question the view, rather common in earlier ages, that we're rationally required to accept PSR. But it might still be reasonable to accept PSR even if we aren't rationally required to accept it. It might be one of those principles that reasonable people have every right to accept. If so, then it's also reasonable to accept what follows from PSR, namely that a self-existent being exists. This is the crux of Reitan's case for God. that there is no compelling case, but it is still reasonable to believe. I think this fundamentally misrepresents the objective basis of rationality. As I understand it, the only way that two equally rational people with access to the same information could disagree is if they disagree on some fundamental rule of logic or axiom. But the principle of sufficient reason is not sufficiently fundamental to qualify for this. For example, there are basic principles that most people agree on that we can't rationally justify. These are things like the primacy of existence, the laws of logic, or that our senses, memories, and reasoning are somewhat reliable. We have to presuppose these things to be able to engage in rational argumentation, and so if someone disagrees, they aren't necessarily being irrational. But once you agree on these things, as Reitan seems to, you must also accept all that logically flows from them. And one of the consequences of accepting these minimal principles is that the burden of proof rests on the claimant. And so, if Reitan cannot provide sufficient reason to believe that the principle of sufficient reason holds true, then all rational people are compelled to reject it as unfounded. Before giving his defence of the principle, Reitan first explains what he means by it. He spends a few pages explaining that even if everything requires an explanation, this doesn't rule out chance events. He puts it like this. And so, when we say there's a sufficient reason for why things are as they are, we don't mean to rule out chance events or arbitrary choices, but to say that when things do happen by chance, there is a sufficient reason why they do. We might formulate this version of PSR as follows. For everything that is the case, there is either a sufficient reason why it, rather than something else, is the case, or a sufficient reason why the precise determination of what is the case must be a matter of chance or arbitrariness. Essentially, Reitan's point is that chance events can still be explained, by reference to the rules of chance and the overarching purpose that lead to them. This is a reasonable stance to take, and while I have reservations about the existence of truly random events, I don't think that if they did exist, they would undermine his point here. Reitan's general point is that randomness cannot provide an ultimate explanation for something. Similarly, Reitan argues that simply understanding the regularities in nature doesn't amount to an explanation of them. He puts it like this. It would be like looking at a Norwegian sweater, describing its pattern, and then saying, see, the reason why there is black yarn on this spot is because that is what the pattern calls for. White yarn would break the pattern. This may sound like an explanation, but it's really just a description. If we give up on PSR, what we've really done is embrace the view that we can describe the universe, hopefully in the most general conceivable terms, but cannot explain it. Not because of some limitation in our capacities, but because there just is no reason out there why anything is as it is. This is a fair point. To accurately model the laws of nature is not the same as to provide an explanation for them. When Kepler developed his laws of planetary motion, they accurately described the motions of the planets, but they did not explain why the planets moved that way. When Newton showed that these equations of motion were a consequence of gravity, he explained why the planets moved as they did, but left open the question of why gravity is that way. Every scientific explanation leaves open the question of why things are the way they are. And if there is no sufficient reason for some things, then Reitan is correct, there is no ultimate explanation. And while it is important to understand the implications of our ideas, here Reitan seems to be hinting at an argument from consequences. Whether we like the implications or not is irrelevant to whether something is true. Reitan continues with this. So the question comes down to this. Could a reasonable person accept PSR in a form that allows for chance events? Or must every reasonable person do away with PSR altogether and say that no reason is the ultimate answer to our most basic questions? I can think of only one plausible argument for the latter. Aside from Reitan's confusion over whether rational people can, in principle, disagree, this is also shifting of the burden of proof. The only argument necessary against the principle is that simply that Reitan has not provided sufficient reason to accept it. Unless and until he does, every reasonable person should do away with it altogether. Reitan goes on to discuss whether some aspects of quantum mechanics undermine the principle of sufficient reason. Reitan's response is in line with what he's already argued, that an ultimate explanation will lie outside of science and hence is immune to scientific inquiry one way or the other. So, if according to Reitan, science can't tell us whether we should accept or reject the principle of sufficient reason, what can we do? Reitan puts it like this. So how do we decide whether to believe a principle like PSR when we can't decide based on either logic or empirical evidence? My answer is this: rational intuition. That is, reflect on the principle. Be sure you clearly see what accepting it and rejecting it imply. And if, after such reflection, it just seems right to you, and if open-minded inquiry reveals no compelling reasons to be suspicious of your intuition, then the most reasonable thing to do is to follow that intuition. For those whose rational intuitions endorse PSR, belief in a transcendent reality is therefore the most reasonable belief. After almost 6 chapters, we finally get to the heart of Reitan's argument for belief in God. And it turns out it's just intuition. The problem here is that Reitan is doing what many poor philosophers do, and is elevating intuition above its usefulness. And in doing so, he is ignoring what science tells us about intuition. Psychology has revealed our intuition to be a collection of heuristics, or rules of thumb, that simplify our thinking. They are grounded in our everyday experience of the world, and reflect the prejudices that come from this. We have very poor intuitions about chance events, about the nature of physical reality, and about the reliability of our own reasoning. Intuition is not some mystical sixth sense that allows us to divine truths about the universe. It is strikingly audacious to think that one can, through armchair reflection, determine whether there is an ultimate meaning to the entirety of existence. Reitan closes this section by saying that given the choice between a universe without meaning and one with, he'll go with God. This is exactly the kind of wishful thinking that atheists deride so much in theists, and which I was hoping Reitan was going to avoid. Concluding remarks. Reitan finishes this chapter by recognising that the cosmological argument, even if it is successful, hardly establishes the existence of a God, let alone his personal God. And while he sees value in the various philosophical arguments for the Christian God, Reitan opts instead to turn to a different argument in the next chapter: religious experiences. He puts it like this: if all rational arguments pointed towards a view of life in which the only reality is what scientific investigation encompasses, then an experience of the divine should probably be dismissed as delusional. But reason isn't so thoroughly on the side of Dawkins' reductionistic view of the world. For those whose intuitions say there must be a reason for it all, a reason why there is something rather than nothing, religious experiences can and should be treated as more than just the result of neural misfiring. Which is a fairly foreboding introduction to the next chapter. Anyway, that's it for this chapter, but before I finish up, I want to discuss some things. Firstly, Reitan has spent almost the entire chapter nailing down how, if everything must have an explanation, then that explanation must be some transcendent necessary reality. While I think there are several problems with the way that he's argued this, the fundamental problem is that he has no good argument for why anyone should believe that everything must have an explanation. The principle of sufficient reason, as Leibniz called it, rests heavily on the idea of a sufficient explanation. But whether something is sufficiently explanatory is an artifact of our flawed human psychology. And while Leibniz might have meant something else by it, the way Reitan has used it here rests heavily on the fact that to many people, a partial explanation is unsatisfactory. I would like to reiterate that Reitan's idea that we can use our intuition to settle undecidable questions is misapplied in this case. Even if it was true in some circumstances, on the matter of whether we should accept the principle of sufficient reason, it is inapplicable. In this case, there are other, more fundamental principles that we can rely on, like the burden of proof and the irrelevancy of unfalsifiable propositions. If whether reality has an ultimate explanation is relevant to us, then it is, in principle, testable. And if it is amenable to philosophical or scientific analysis, then no one, not even people who find it intuitively appealing, should accept it unless and until there is good reason to do so. And Reitan has presented no good reason here. Anyway, that's it for this time. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think, and if I've missed anything. Next time, I'll be covering Chapter 7, Religious Consciousness. Until then, see ya.